would you please welcome David Barton?
Thank you. Most of us are Americans, and we live in a very unique and a very blessed nation. We have a form of government unlike any others. If you keep track of international affairs, there's 195 nations that are in the world right now. Of those 195 nations, there's some things that make America a little different from all others, not the least of which is our stability. We have had one constitution since 1789. And if you look at the other nations and how often they have constitutions, imagine living in a country where you've had 20 constitutions, 25 constitutions, the same time that we've had one. We have such stability, we take it for granted. We think that it's normal. It is not. The average length of the Constitution in the world is 17 years. If you guys were in other countries, most of you would have already lived through a revolution in your lifetime. In America, not only you have not lived through a revolution, your parents have not, your grandparents have not, your great-grandparents have not, your great-great-grandparents have not. We've been blessed with stability in a way that no other nation has. In the same way, we have been blessed with creativity that other nations do not enjoy. The creativity we enjoy, we can measure in a number of ways. You can measure through copyrights, patents, but America is only 4% of the world's population. Every year, America produces more in the way of medical technology, actual technology, discoveries, cures, symphonies, literature, art. We produce more than the other 96% of the world. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. Our 4% produces more than the 96% of the rest of the world. We are so surrounded with technology and advances, we think it's normal. It is not. If you live in other nations, you do not enjoy near the level of convenience that we have. The same thing with our prosperity. When you look at our economic prosperity, and look at our economic prosperity in the nation, we have 4% of the world's population, 25% of the world's gross domestic product. America does not produce more wealth because we have greater natural resources. We simply don't. There are many more nations that have greater natural resources than we do, but we take ours and make it go further than other nations. So we've been very blessed. In 1831, we received the title American exceptionalism as a result of this. Election came to America and said, looking at the Americans, what they have is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will have that. American exceptionalism is a term that is used today. Now, interesting, in secular academia, they hate that term. I wrote a book a couple of years ago where I talked about that and got attacked by all sorts of professors saying, how dare you say that America is different from other nations? I'm sorry, but we are. I mean, it's just statistically, it's easy to prove. So I want to show you what causes us to be different, because if you don't know what causes us to be different, you can't preserve it, and we won't be different. We'll be like other nations, and that means revolutions every 17 years or so, which is not something we look forward to. It means a reduction. Do you know that poverty in the rest of the world, the World Bank sets the standard for poverty for the world. They say if you live on $2 a day in a developing nation like America, if you live on $2 a day, that you live in poverty. That's $730 a year is the poverty level for the world. In America, our poverty level for a family of four is $44,000. Now, the rest of the world thinks poverty is at $730. We think it's at $44,000. What a difference is that? We don't want to be like the rest of the world. We have such a higher standard, but we just are not aware of that because we're surrounded by it. So you look at American exceptionalism. Let me define that. American exceptionalism, very simply, is what describes the unprecedented stability, freedom, and prosperity, the stuff I was just telling you about, that's the result of institutions and policies. That's the result produced by our unique governing philosophy. So our governing philosophy, the sequence in which we have this stuff is the governing philosophy is what produces our institutions and our policies. Our institutions and our policies is what produce the things that we enjoy, and that's the stability, freedom, and prosperity, which means the most important part of America is really our governing philosophy. The reason that we have different results from other nations is we have a different governing philosophy. Other nations, every other nation has a government, but they don't get the results that we get. And if you remember back in your earth science classes, back in 8th grade, etc., we talked about the parts of a tree that exist. There are 3 parts of a tree, and as you look at those 3 parts of the tree, the first part is the roots. It's what you plant. It's the seed. That's actually the philosophy of governments, philosophy of any nation that grows. From that grows a structure, that's the branches, the roots, and that's the institutions, the policies, and that's what eventually produces the stuff that everybody enjoys, and that's the fruits up top. So if you like good fruits, you have to have the right kind of seed. If you enjoy apples, you can't plant a lemon seed and get apples out of it. It's just not going to work. So the governing philosophy that you put into the nation is what will produce the outcome, and the outcome that America has is different from every other nation in the the world. God is no respecter of persons. The Bible tells us that. He is no respecter of nations. Any nation at all that will take the right seed and plant it will get the same results that we have. So at this point, we remain a unique nation in that we planted a different seed that is continuing to produce results that everybody else enjoys and wishes they had. They just don't. So what in the world is that unique governing philosophy? I mean, we call this stuff American exceptionalism. And what is it that makes America different? Well, it's a seed. It's that philosophy. And so what is the philosophy that produced American exceptionalism? I want to give it to you so that you understand it very clearly. Now, Tim and I, we own 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I own thousands of handwritten documents of just about anything in American history you want to know about, whether it be black history, whether it be church history, whether it be the revivals in America, whether it be military history, whether it be constitutional history. Thousands of documents from George Washington, John Adams, and all those guys. We've got so many documents to go back and look at. And when you look at what produced American exceptionalism, it's easy to see because we have it in our documents. One of the documents that is the key to America is the Declaration of Independence. It's the birth certificate. It's where our founding fathers told the rest of the world why we're doing exactly what we're doing. And they gave us 126 words right up front that said, here's the 5 principles of American government. We want the whole world to know what we're doing here is built on these 5 principles. Now, in America today, we don't cover those principles, all that history that I've gotten, that Tim and I own. As a result of that, I'm appointed in a number of states by state boards of education to write history and social studies standards for states. So I see what's in textbooks. We just flat don't teach anything about American history anymore in the sense of knowing what our roots are. So we're told in the Bible in Psalms 11:3 that foundations be destroyed. What are the righteous going to do? I mean, if the foundation of this chapel be destroyed, the thing's going to fall in eventually. The most important part of this structure is not what you see, it's what you don't see. It's what's under here. It's the foundation. If that foundation goes away, the whole structure goes away. So the foundation of American government is in 126 words. They have 5 principles. Let me give you those 5 principles. They're pretty simple. The first principle in the Declaration, we told the world, said all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator. Now, what we have just done is we have announced to the world that in America, we believe that there is a Creator. That's the acknowledgement that we have. We have the acknowledgement of a divine Creator. Now, it's interesting. I've been involved in 7 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court, and they deal with religious expression. The court says, oh, you know, in America, we got a lot of people who are atheists. They don't believe in God. We got agnostics. We got others. And from the government standpoint, we have to treat everybody equally. So we're not going to take a position on whether there is or is not a God, because some people don't believe that, and so we have to be neutral and all. No, that's not the way America was founded. This belief that there is a God, we told the world that, and as a matter of fact, they told us very clearly. They said this is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This is something every political entity in America agrees on. There is a Creator, and we're telling the world that in America, every one of our political institutions believe there's a Creator. We're not neutral on this. The American founding is not neutral on whether or not there is a God. We're very clear on that. And you see, that's the first step toward having limited government. If you study the Bible and what the Bible says about government, there are hundreds of verses in the Bible on government, and what the Bible teaches is a limited government. And limited government simply means one thing, and that is that government's not to get involved in everything. So when you say there is a God, you have now limited government by telling government that quite frankly, we've told government that there is a power higher than you. In the Declaration, we said, government, you're not God. And you see, secular governments across the world think they are God. That's why if you homeschool in Germany, you will go to jail. You cannot do that. If you're in Scotland, for example, you will find that from the time you were born, children do not belong to the parents. The state at that time they assign a government official to your child because it's the government that's going to raise your child. You just think you. So all sorts of things don't exist in secular governments. You do not have a limited government. They get involved in every single thing. If you're in France and try to share the gospel, called proselytizing, you will spend jail time for sharing the gospel. So in secular governments, you have unlimited governments. In America, we said, government, you're not God. You don't make all the decisions. You only get to make a certain set of decisions. And so we're telling you up front, every one of our political institutions believe that there's God, and that means they're all limited. Now, it's interesting the way George Washington dealt with this. George Washington, as soon as he became president, we got into the Bill of Rights, finished the Bill of Rights in October of 1789. At the point in time, on the day that we finished the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which limits government, which tells us what our individual rights are. On that day, Congress asked the president, they said, based on what we've just done, finishing the Bill of Rights, we really need to acknowledge God in what we've done. And Washington thought that was a great idea, so he issued the first federal acknowledgement of God, the first call for the nation federally, under the federal government, to stop and acknowledge God. And in doing so, why would he do that? Well, he tells us right at the top here, and this is what George Washington says. This is why we should acknowledge God. He said, it is the duty of nations. And notice the word duty. The word duty back then means something different from what it does now. Back then, the word duty was defined as a legally binding contractual obligation. It's the same as if I sign a contract to the bank and get it notarized. It is the duty. It's a legally binding contractual obligation of nations. Now, interestingly, in 1913, our dictionaries changed the word duty to be a responsibility. And if you look up the word duty in dictionaries today, it says that which one ought to do. Well, there's a world of difference between that which one ought to do and a legally binding contractual obligation. George Washington said governments have he said it's a legally binding contractual obligation of nations, not of individuals. He says political entities have a legally binding contractual obligation to do four things. Notice the four verbs he used. He said, number one, you're to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Number two, you're to obey His will. Number three, you're to be grateful for His benefits. And number four, you're humbly to implore His protection and favor. And that is the duty of nations. That's what nations are supposed to do. So the notion we have today that, government has to be neutral on religion, no, that's not the way we were founded. We acknowledge there's a God because that's the first step in limiting government. So that's the first thing that makes America different from other nations, is we say God's in charge, not human government. God is at the top of the whole pyramid of this thing. God's the one up top. The second thing we say is they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, what we do at that point is we say there's a certain set of rights that come only from God, and that's the second step to limiting government. And explain how this works. It's jurisdictional. By that statement, we've established jurisdictions. For example, I'm a cowboy. I'm from out west of here toward Jack Sparrow, and I've got a nice red pickup that I use on my ranch. And, Tim, my son's got a black pickup that he uses, and it's great, but I like red better than black, so I go over and spray paint his truck red because everybody needs a red pickup. No, I can't do that. I can spray paint anything I own red. I can spray paint my cows red. I can spray paint my pastures red. I can make my roads be red, but I can't go over and spray paint anybody else's truck. And see what we did by telling government, there are certain things you can't spray paint red. There's a set of rights that belong to God. You can't touch them. You can't control them. You can't regulate them. They come from God. They're outside of your jurisdiction. You cannot spray paint anything red that does not belong to you. So that's the second step in limiting government. Now, inalienable rights that's not a term that we use that much today. And when you look at inalienable rights, what is an inalienable right? And fortunately for us, the guys who wrote that in our documents define the term. For example, you have John Dickinson, who's a signer of the Constitution, one of the originators of our documents. He said an inalienable right is a right which God gave to you, which no inferior power has the right to take away. There's a certain set of rights that came to you from God, not from government, and if they came to you from God, government cannot touch them. You also have Alexander Hamilton, signer of the Constitution. He said very similar. He said inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments and musty records. This isn't something that government gave you. He said these are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by any mortal power. In other words, you've got a set of rights that God gave to you, and government cannot mess with those rights. You have the same thing from John Adams. John Adams said it this way. He says inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly governments. He said they're rights that are derived, they're rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by any human legislature. They're rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. But notice the word antecedent. He said these are rights that, antecedent means came before. He said the rights that God gives you came before any earthly government. Now here's my question. What's the first earthly government in the history of the world? The first recorded human government in the history of mankind, because John Adams says inalienable rights were rights that were given before government ever existed. The first government given in the history of the world recorded anywhere is actually recorded in the Bible. The Bible is the one that records the history of the oldest government, and it is the government that happened when Noah and his sons and their wives got off the ark. At that point in Genesis 9, God gave what are called the 7 Noahide laws. That's the first civil government. It said, Noah, here's what you do with murderers, here's what you do with thieves, and he gave 7 categories of civil laws. It was the first legal system ever delivered in the history of the world. This is how you treat each other horizontally. This is what civil government will do. Now, John Adams said that inalienable rights are antecedent to the first human government. So
Genesis 9 is where human government appears. Inalienable rights appear in Genesis 1 through Genesis 8. And the Founding Fathers identified about 24 rights that appeared in the first 8 chapters of Genesis. There were rights that God gave to every individual. Just because you're a human, you get a certain set of rights. About 24 rights that God gave that came before human government. Therefore, government cannot spray paint these 24 rights red. They do not belong to government. Government's not allowed to touch those rights. So that was the belief we had. Now, what are some of those rights? If you look at some of the inalienable rights that are there, Sam Adams, for example, called the father of the American Revolution, and the Declaration of Independence, they said, now look, we told you that among other rights, there were 3 inalienable rights, and those are the rights to life, to liberty, and to property. That's 3 out of the 24, but there's others. And in other words, they've said right up top, government cannot regulate anything regarding life or liberty or property. Those came from God, not from government. Government's got to keep their hands off them. Then 11 years later, after the Declaration was over and we won the American Revolution, we did the Constitution, we came back with the Bill of Rights. And in the Bill of Rights, we said, remember we told you 11 years ago that among others there were 3 rights? Well, let us tell you some of the others. First Amendment right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. Government, you can't touch that. Second Amendment right to self-defense. Government, you can't touch that. Founders called that the biblical right of self-defense. The Third Amendment right to the sanctity of the home. The Fourth Amendment right to justice. The Fifth Amendment right to private property. The Bill of Rights goes through and lists another 14 to 15 different rights that we have. And so in the Bill of Rights and in the Declaration, we cover most of those 24, not all of them, about 18 or so are covered. There's about half a dozen they didn't put in the documents, but that's because everybody knew what those 24 rights were. So what we've done in the second part of our government is there is a God. God gives a certain set of rights to man, and government's not allowed to touch those rights. As a matter of fact, that leads to the third point of government, is it says that to secure these rights, what rights? Inalienable rights. To secure inalienable rights is why governments are instituted among men. So what we've done is we said the primary purpose of government is to secure these inalienable rights. Primary purpose of government is not to make sure everybody has a job or a good income. It's not to secure the borders. The primary purpose of government is to make sure you have the right to practice those 24 rights that God told you, because there's a history of government to get involved and say, no, 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 you don't have the right to self-defense. We'll tell you what you can do with weapons or guns or anything. No, no, you don't have the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. We'll tell you when and where you can worship God. You can't say the word God at graduation. You can't have an nativity scene. See, it's a tendency of government to want to regulate all these rights that God gave us. So the third thing we say that made America different was government exists, first and foremost, to make sure that these inalienable rights are not touched by government. And so we go through, and James Wilson, who's a signer of the Declaration and Constitution, one of the most famous founding fathers, he started the first law school in America while he's sitting on the Supreme Court as an original justice. So he's the second most active member in writing the Constitution. George Washington puts him on the court as a justice on the court. On the court, he starts a law school, and he told the students in the law school why it was that we had the American Revolution. And he was just real plain with them. He said, the principal object of government was to acquire new security for the possession of those rights which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise, all-beneficent Creator. In other words, we had a certain set of rights that were given us by God, and Great Britain would not allow us to practice those rights. That's why we have a new government. We have a new government because that's the purpose of government, is to secure your right to these 24 inalienable rights, and that's why we created a new government. That's why America broke away, was we wanted to secure the inalienable rights that Great Britain refused to do. So that was the purpose of government. You have Sam Adams, who makes a very similar statement. Sam Adams said, government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights, and that's where he said, first is life, second liberty, third is property. Now, today in this culture, with what we have with abortion and Roe v. Wade, we say, wouldn't it have been really cool if when they were talking about a right to life, if they were talking about abortion? Now, obviously they weren't, because, you know, Roe v. Wade happened in 1973. These guys back then, they had horses, not cars. They didn't even know what the internet was. Obviously, they weren't talking about abortion, and that's where we get things wrong. We're told in Ecclesiastes 1:9, there is nothing new under the sun. Technology changes. Human nature does not change. You see, ever since there have been pregnancies, there were people who did not want to be pregnant. So there's nothing new about abortions. Matter of fact, 3 books in the Old Testament deal, and God specifically addresses that you're not to take the life of an unborn child. You have that in Deuteronomy, you have it in Leviticus, you have it in Numbers. So back when God created his nation of Israel 3,500 years ago, he laid out laws on abortion, which is why abortion is not a new thing in America. Here's one of the books we actually own. It's from 1808, and it's about abortion in America. Abortion's not something new. What's new is that we allow abortion rather than not allow it, but the technology is the only thing that changes with abortion. There's been ways of taking the life of unborn children for thousands of years. We just have different ways of doing that today. So when you look back to what they say about abortion, if I take you back to James Wilson and you look at the right to life, James Wilson again wrote that first law book. He dealt with abortion in that first law book 200 years ago. This is what he told students. He said, students, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. He says, in the contemplations of law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb, and by the law that life is protected. Now, he says it's really simple. As soon as you know there's life in the womb, at that point, government steps in to protect that life. Now, here's where technology changes. Back in their day, at what stage did you know for sure there was life in the womb? 2 to 3 months in is when you knew for sure. But whenever you knew, that's when government stepped. Today, with technology, we know 8 days after conception that there's life in the womb. The point is, as soon as you know there's life there, government's supposed to step in and protect that life because God is the one who gives life. And you see, that made us different from Europe at the time. Europe was very secular, even back then. John Witherspoon, another of our founding fathers, signed the Declaration. He said, that's the difference. He says, in Europe, they think that parents create children. In America, we know that God creates children. In Europe, they allow parents to take the lives of children through things like abortion. We don't allow that in America because we know that life comes from God. It doesn't come from parents. And that's what he pointed out. A perfect right in a state of natural liberty is the right to life. He says, here in America, we've denied the power of life and death to parents. We don't let parents take the life of kids because parents create kids. It's God who creates life. It's not parents. So all the way through, we protected the inalienable right to life, and that meant the issue of abortion. Now, when he says first, that word first has a special significance. I've been involved in the political arena for a long time. I've held political office. I've recruited hundreds of people for office. I've trained thousands of people for office. I work from presidents of the United States all the way down to dog catchers in political affairs. And what I have found is if I can find out first where any candidate stands on the life issue, with a 90% degree of certainty, I can tell you exactly how they will vote on every other issue that comes before them. If you'll tell me where a U.S. Senator is on the life issue, I will tell you how they voted on the Small Arms Treaty. I will tell you what they did on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I'll tell you how they voted on global warming and climate change. You tell me where they are in life with a 90% degree of accuracy. I'll tell you how they voted on the capital gains tax. I'll tell you how they voted on the estate tax. You just tell me life, and I'll get the other 90% right. And you see, the reason with that is real simple, is life is the first of all the inalienable rights. If I know where they are on the life issue, see, it's real simple. If you get off track on the life issue, you're now off the road. You're off track, and you're going down, and everything's going to be wrong because you're no longer on track. So if you get the first of the inalienable rights wrong, you'll get all the others wrong. And that's why you'll find that people who are wrong on life are also wrong on public religious acknowledgments and conscience. Hobby Lobby can't have a conscience. Little Sisters of the Poor. We had 7 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court last year on whether you can acknowledge God according to the dictates of conscience. Can the Little Sisters of the Poor actually not be engaged in abortion? Of course they can't. They've got to be involved in abortion. Can Hobby Lobby have a conscience as a bit? Of course it can't. If you have pro-abortion people, they will not protect your right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. It's just real simple. And I can show you hundreds of examples of that. That's what we see at the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, very pro-abortion, and here they are continually restricting our rights to acknowledge God. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Second Amendment right to defend yourself. You'll find those who are pro-abortion are also anti-guns. They're gun control. They don't want you to have the right to defend yourself. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Third Amendment right to the sanctity of the home. Which is interesting that those who are wrong on the life issue are also wrong on the definition of marriage. Those two things go hand in hand because God established both. And if you're wrong on life, then you're going to be wrong on. You think that man created marriage instead of God creating marriage, even though God clearly defines marriage in the Bible from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, Genesis 3, all the way Jesus repeats it in Matthew 19. Marriage is a lifelong union of a man and a woman. You have it in Exodus 20 as well. No. Man is the one who creates marriage, so we can define it how we want to. And by the way, because we can do that, we can also define where life begins and when you can take life. So when you put man in charge of life, you also lose the definition of marriage. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Fifth Amendment right to own private property, which is why the same Supreme Court that gave us the Roe v. Wade decision also gave us the Kelo decision, says if you don't use your private property right, the government has a right to take it from you and give it to someone who will use it better than you will. No, it's my private property. You can't take that. No. See if you get wrong on the abortion issue, you get wrong. Now, granted, everything I've just mentioned to you is what they call social issues. And political pundits always tell us that, oh, voters don't care about social issues. All they care about is economic issues. That's all anybody looks at when they vote. And unfortunately, they happen to be right. 45% of evangelicals vote their pocketbook over their morality. And that's not the right way to do it. The Bible tells us in Matthew 6:33, Jesus says, if you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, all this other stuff will get added to you. Because they were saying, Lord, where do we get our clothing? Where do we get our housing? Where do we get our food? He says, look around you. Look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds of the air. If you'll seek first righteousness, all this other stuff will get added to you. So Jesus made it real clear, righteousness goes above all the material things. But what happens is 45% of evangelicals vote economics above morality. So we think economic issues are the big deal. And if you think economic issues are the big deal, there's a lot of stuff to be concerned about with where the government's moving on economic issues. The Bible clearly addresses economic issues. But what's interesting is, let me take you back for a minute to what happens in federal government. I was with a group recently, and I said, how many issues can you name that the federal government has addressed in the last 2 years? Because the session of Congress is 2 years. We elect people 2 years later. We have no more elections. And they could come up with about a dozen issues. In any given session of Congress, they will deal with between 10 and 13,000 issues, which means 99.9% of what goes on in Congress you never hear about. Media never tells you. You'll hear about a dozen issues over the course of 2 years. They have between 10 and 13,000 they deal with, which is why there are all sorts of groups in Washington, D.C. that do nothing but monitor their specific issue. You have the China caucus. They'll monitor every vote that deals with China, and there'll be dozens of them. You have the Navy caucus. They'll monitor every vote that deals with votes on the Navy. You have the gang caucus. You have the Iran caucus. You have all these caucuses. And one of the caucuses you have is a pro-life caucus. And so groups like National Right to Life, who care about nothing but the life issue, they don't care about the marriage issue, they don't care about self-defense, they care about life. They monitor the hundreds of votes that happen with any congressman. And every year they release a list of how every member of Congress, how every member of House and the Senate voted. And it's striking that if you take the members of the House of Representatives that vote best on life, just that one issue, how they vote on the life issue, they release that list every year. And so as it turns out, these are the guys on the current list. These are 100%ers on life. And I can't fit them all on the screen because it goes from top 100%ers all the way down to 0%ers at the bottom. There's 435 guys on the list. I show you about a dozen number, 12 or 13 or however many that is. So these guys, but remember, for this discussion, we don't care about life. All we care about is economics. So if all we care about is economics, then we want to look at groups like Americans for Prosperity, Americans for Tax Reform, Freedom Works, other groups like that who monitor nothing but economic votes to these guys. They don't care a whit about marriage. They don't care a whit about life. All they care about is economics. And they also release their standings. And it's striking that if you see there, it's a one-to-one correlation. The ones who are the best on life issues are the best on economic issues. And by conversely, if you look at the right to life on the worst life people, those who get 0%ers, and you take something like Americans for Prosperity, you find the same thing. They're off. Now, that's that one-to-one correlation. If you can tell me where they are on life, I can tell you where they are on all other issues. The reason is, economically, I mean, if they won't protect your life, why would they protect your money? Your life is worth a whole lot more important than your money. And so people who vote on the basis of economics don't get the fact that inalienable rights are more important than economic rights. If you don't get the inalienable rights right, everything else is wrong. So life is the number one issue in which we vote. And I have people who come to me all the time and want me to endorse them in their race. They think that helps in that race. So here comes a dog catcher, and this dog catcher says, will you endorse me for dog catcher? And I say, well, first, tell me where you are on the abortion issue. He said, wait a minute, did you not hear? I said dog catcher. We don't do abortions as dog catchers. I said, yeah, I know. But the problem is you might not stay dog catcher. You might decide to run for city council, and then you might run for mayor, and you might run for school board and president of school board. You might run for state rep, and it's a whole lot easier to knock you off as a dog catcher than it is to knock you off as a governor. And so what you do is you create a litmus test that says, you know, if you don't get the first inalienable right together, if you don't get that one right, then you're not going to get the rest. You'll be off track, and you'll get everything off track. And so I don't care what you're running for. Life is the number one issue I'm going to look at because, again, with a 90% degree of certainty, I can tell you how they will vote on every other issue. If they get the life issue wrong, they'll get everything else wrong, or at least 90% of those things wrong. So that's the third thing that makes American government unique. is the fact that we say government exists to protect inalienable rights, and the first of those rights is life. The fourth thing that our Declaration tells us is it says, to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station in which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them. Now, what you get here is we have just been told that there is a fixed moral standard, a fixed moral law that exists out there. And you go, how do you get a fixed moral law out of that? Well, there's 8 words in that phrase that every American used to recognize, and those 8 words are the laws of nature and nature's God. Those 8 words came out of the most famous law book of the day, Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. Matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson said that Americans studied Blackstone's commentaries, American attorneys studied Blackstone commentaries like Muslims studied the Quran. I mean, this was the book. So what happens is Blackstone, and talking about the laws of nature and nature's God, he says that is the dual revelation of God. Whoa, time out, that's heresy. There's not a dual revelation of God. There's just one God, yeah, but he revealed himself in 2 ways. I don't know what you guys hear, but I hear from critics that say, you know, you Christians, you say you have a loving God. How can you have a loving God if he would send someone to hell who's never heard the gospel, someone in a distant land who's never, and what do you say to that? I say to that exactly what Paul said to that in Romans 1:20. Paul said that everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead. Now, we're getting into deep theology now because Godhead's been debated for thousands of years. He said, Paul said, everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead, have been revealed through what God has created so that even the heathen are without excuse. Now, according to Paul in the inspired scripture, the creation so reveals the truth about God, including Jesus, that nobody has an excuse for not knowing, whether a missionary ever gets there or not. You go, wow, really? Yeah, see, this is the real difference is we today, in our age, we don't spend much time studying nature. We used to. Psalm 46:10 says, be still, know that I'm God. If you go out and sit and look at an anthill, you should learn that you're supposed to have a savings account. You should learn about how the federal budget is supposed to operate. I can take you through an anthill, and from that I can give you economic principles that should guide your life just from studying the ants. But see, we don't do that kind of contemplation today. And it's significant that we used to. We used to say, you know, everything you need to know about God has been revealed in creation, but we don't study. And that's why, by the way, you rarely find an atheist living in the country because they're closer to nature. Most of your atheists live in cities where they're surrounded by concrete and everything man-made. If you sit down and think about what God made, you find God in a very real way. But as Blackstone pointed out, when Adam sinned and fell and messed up our thinking, things aren't as clear anymore. Sin gets in the way. And so God says, okay, I get it. In compassion to where you are, let me just write it out for you. And so that's the laws of nature's God. That's the written scriptures. So the laws of nature is what God created in nature. The laws of nature's God is what God gave us in the scriptures, and those 2 things do not contradict. Now, it's interesting. If I take only the laws of nature and if I leave the Bible out, I can take a very clear position on what's right and wrong without using the Bible. For example, if I take the issue of self-defense. Now, I could go to Exodus 22:2. I could go to Nehemiah 7, Nehemiah 9. I could go to Luke 19 and show you all about the Bible and self-defense, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go back to my experience because, again, I'm a cowboy. I mean, this is what I do. Horses and the cattle and the ranch and everything that goes with it. I've got cowboy friends, and we end up in some of the wildest places across the country. We'll end up in places you wonder, how in the heck did you get back there? And that's just a different kind of life that we enjoy and a different kind of life that we live. And so with what we do, we get in very rugged places, very dangerous places. I was riding recently in a place where that as we were coming off a ridge. I was up on top of a mesa, and my right-hand stirrup was below me, was 600 feet, was where the ground level was. So we're on a narrow little path with a horse, and my right stirrup is hanging out over air, 600 feet down. If I fall out of the saddle, I'm dead. If my horse slips, we're both dead. And so what happens is when you ride places where we ride, you have to have a good relationship with your horse. And so I spend a lot of time with, taking care of my horses. We got a great relationship. Vets, they get great vets. They get great food. They get all the stuff you need in a barn. And so we got a great relationship because if I need my horse to go down that narrow goat trail on the side of a cliff, I can't have any kind of ruckus going on because we'll both die. If I need that horse to swim a river, I can't have a ruckus because we'll both die. So we got great relationships, but it's interesting that when Mare, she recently had a foal, and when she had that colt, I go in the barn to feed her, and I'd get a hoof print right in the middle of my forehead. We had this great relationship, but it kicked into her that you don't mess with my kids. I will defend my kids. And what you see is that God has put in nature, they will defend their own lives, they will defend their kids, and they will defend their property. She'd chase me out of the barn and go, wait a minute, I built you the barn. No, she thinks it's her home. So she chased, and it doesn't matter whether you take dogs or cats or bears or anything else. You can pass any law you want that says you don't have the right to defend yourself, and everything in nature will ignore that law, because that is a law of nature. It's the right of self-defense. You also have the right of liberty. There's 10 million species in nature. There's not a single one that enslaves another species. Well, why didn't the Founding Fathers? Because they were all a bunch of pro-slavery? No. 3/4 of the Founding Fathers were anti-slavery. They abolition leaders or started anti-slavery societies or spoke out. And those 3/4 of the Founding Fathers told the other 1/4, they said, you guys are violating the laws of nature. There's slavery nowhere in nature. And matter of fact, you're violating the laws of nature's God, because here's what the scripture says in Isaiah 63 and in Luke 4. So the laws of nature, nature's God say there should be no slavery. You also have the laws of nature talking about abortion, because in 10 million species, there's not a single species in nature that kills its young while it's still in the womb. I don't care if you believe in evolution or creation. I'm a creation guy. All right, you believe in evolution? Show me anything in your system that kills a young while it's still in the womb. It's a violation of all natural process, whether it's evolutionary or creation. And again, I believe creation. You've also got the issue of homosexuality. 10 million species in nature, there's not a single species that has homosexuality as a lifestyle. It's not. Now, there's about a half dozen species that have occasions of homosexuality, but even there, it's occasions, it's not a lifestyle. The laws of nature say homosexuality, that's not a lifestyle. And then you can take transgender, which is the new thing that's out right now for the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm going back to my cowboy days. Earlier this year, I was in the Black Hills of North Dakota, very rugged stuff, and down in all those valleys and crevices there, we have to chase the cattle out of there, and they're like wild deer. It's like herding deer. They're wild. You chase them out, you get them up on top of the mesa, and then you start driving them. So a bunch of us, we got them on top of the mesa. We're driving about 1,200 head across the top of the mesa. We put them in cattle pens, and the reason we do is we got to find the young calves, and we got to take them out and treat them. There's about 7 different diseases they can get, so we have to vaccinate them for different diseases, and then we put ear tags in them, and we check them for health, etc. So as we did that, we send a cowboy in. They will rope one of the calves and bring it out, and then the rest of us will jump on that calf and take care of it. And so I'm the guy in the plaid shirt there, standing up. The guy on the right side of the picture is putting an ear tag, marking the calf to know who it belongs to, and then I'll fall on top of it and I'll put a vaccination in, and we take care of the diseases. And it's interesting, we had both cowboys and cowgirls working that roundup, and we dealt with 580 calves. We roped and pulled out, individually treated 580 calves. And cowboys and cowgirls, not a one of us had any difficulty knowing which was a male calf and which was a female calf. It was really easy to tell. Now, today there are 82 different genders that you can choose. If you're up with Facebook, you know that Facebook has 66 different genders you can choose. And yet the Bible says that God created them male and female. That's all. There's just 2 genders. That's all there ever. From the time of Adam to the time of the present, if you were a human, you always looked between your legs to find what your gender was. Now you look between your ears to find what your gender is. You know, how crazy is that? And so the laws of nature really clear. Transgender is not part of the laws of nature, and also the Bible speaks about it as well. I can go through the other things. Property, from the time you're born in nature, you stake out private property, and when you die, somebody else takes it, but while you live, you have your own private property. You have the right of association. I'm an Angus cow. I can run with the Holsteins if I want. I can run with the Herefords if I want. I can run with the goats if I want. I can run with the sheep. I've got the choice of what herds I want to belong to and what herds I want to be part of. Government now tells us which herds we have to be part of. You also have accumulation profit. You know, the squirrel in nature accumulates all these acorns, and nobody says, Mr. Squirrel, you've accumulated too many acorns. You need to share it with everybody else. Yeah, he gets to accumulate and keep everything he accumulates. So do raccoons, so do pack rats, so do beavers. I mean, all this stuff, these are inalienable rights. These are things that come from nature. But you also have in nature, what does nature teach us about theft? Well, what nature teaches us about theft is very common. I have 4 horses, and when I feed my 4 horses, none of them eat their own food. They go steal the food from every other horse. So theft is very common in nature. So is adultery. That's why monogamy is not common in nature. That's why you have one bull and 40 cows for every herd. You have the same difficulty with incest because, see, cowboys won't ride Mustangs because Mustangs have been inbred for so many years. They, you know, the fathers and the daughters, and they're so inbred that they don't have stamina. We don't ride Mustangs because of the incest that occurs. And then you also have murder. Murder is common in nature. You ever seen what a skunk does inside a hen house? Spreads blood everywhere. It's not looking for food. They just kill. So if we're saying the laws of nature tell us what's right and wrong, then what do you do with things like theft and adultery and incest and murder? Because that's common in nature. That's where we have the laws of nature's God. The laws of nature's God says, let me make it really clear. You're not understanding this. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. So between the laws of nature and nature's God, we have a very clear understanding of what is right and wrong. This is morals, and that's what we talked about in the Declaration of Independence, and that's what we call the common law, which is now the Seventh Amendment to the Constitution. It establishes fixed rights and wrongs, but today we're told, no, rights and wrongs is what you want. Marriage is how we define it. We define when life begins. No. The Bible does that, and nature does that. So we've always had, that's the fourth thing that makes us unique. The fifth thing that makes us unique, very quickly, is governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's what we call the will of the majority, the consent of the governed. The majority wins. George Washington, he explained it this way. He says, the fundamental principle of the Constitution requires that the will of the majority prevail. That's why the U.S. Senate is dead wrong right now. The U.S. Senate, they have what's called the filibuster, which is something they've had since 1972. And under the filibuster, it takes 60 votes to beat 40 votes. Or the other way around is 40 votes beats 60 votes. Right now, the majority never wins in the U.S. Senate unless you get over 60 votes. If I have 59 votes, the 41 will beat me every single time in the U.S. Senate. That's why nothing gets through the Senate, because it takes 60 votes to get it through. No, the fundamental principle of the Constitution requires that the will of the majority. If I've got 51 votes, I should be winning, not in the Senate. And Thomas Jefferson, who started the other political party of the day, he said the same thing. The will of the majority is the natural law of every society, the only sure guardian of the rights of man. So the will of the majority. But I want you to notice the sequence that these five things occurred in. The first is there is a divine creator. The second is he gives us a certain set of rights. The third is that government exists to protect those rights. The fourth is there is a fixed moral law. And the fifth is you've got the right to the will of the majority. But notice the will of the majority is the last, which means the majority vote doesn't have anything to do with your rights or your morals. We can have a vote that says we've had a referendum and we voted on the issue of rape, and by a margin of 70 to 30, we decided rape is no longer a crime. I'm sorry, rape will always be a crime because it violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. You don't get to vote on morals because God's established the morals. Well, we're going to vote on whether you can defend yourself if you get attacked. No, we're not going to have a vote on that because that's an inalienable right that God gave me before government ever existed. I have the right to self-defense regardless of what you think. So we can have, then what do you vote on? Well, you can vote on whether the sidewalk should be 4 feet wide or 5 feet wide or 6 feet wide. You can vote on whether the speed limit should be 45, 55, or 85. I mean, we can vote on things. You cannot vote on morals, and you cannot vote on inalienable rights because they come from God. Outside of that, we can vote. So notice that the only way that government works is if it's not secular. 4 of those 5 points, 4 of those 5 things you just saw there, 4 of them dealt with God. They're God-centered. That's why you cannot find you cannot find Turkey or Morocco or Spain or Italy. You find any secular government in the world, it is not a limited government. The only way you have freedoms is to have a non-secular government, and that's why the God factor is the thing that made America different. That's what other countries don't use today, but that's the philosophy that made us different from all other things. So you need to know that so you can protect that, so that as you choose people for dog catchers to the President of the United States, don't choose secular-minded people because you'll lose your rights every time. Our rights are only secure when we remember that they come from God. So let's take a break here. Dr. Bridges, back to you, sir.
Would you just pray with me right now, right where you're at? Heavenly Father, we just lift up this specific way to impact the nation of Saudi Arabia. There are so many things we will be praying about in our classes today, the different aspects of evangelism that do exist. But today especially, we pray for men and women traveling, students attending universities around this world, that they would find themselves in an environment, maybe a business person doing business with a Christian organization or with a business that the representative is a born-again believer with a heart for God, sensitive to what God is challenging them to do, to share the gospel with others, and that in that opportunity, Lord, individuals would come to Christ, and then in turn, they would go back and share what they have experienced with their families, with their friends, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, haven't you enjoyed David already? Yeah. And would you welcome him back, David Barton?
Thank you, sir. Let me start off, we've kind of looked backward for a while. I'm going to do a little more looking backward, but I'm going to drive it home to where we are right now and what it means for us and how we live with this stuff today. I'm going to start with a Bible verse. It's very simple, Proverbs 14:34. This is the most significant verse for any nation at any point in time, including America. It says, righteousness exalts a nation, sends a reproach to any people. What makes a nation go up or come down is righteousness. That's God's law. That's what he says. It's real simple. Righteousness exalts, sin takes down. So the question becomes, all right, how do we know whether nation's in righteousness or not? How do you measure that? And by the way, this Bible verse has been used across American history. I can show you in the founding era. I can show you up to this era. I want to take somebody in the Civil War. You probably heard about Frederick Douglass. You probably haven't heard that he was a minister of the gospel. He was AME Zion minister, huge civil rights leader. He served in 4 different presidential administrations, one of the most politically engaged individuals in his day. And toward end of life, as he looked back over all of his political involvement, he had a great statement. He says, I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one. It's widely and generally assented to. Nevertheless, it's generally trampled on, disregarded. When I tell everybody this, they all say, oh, yeah. But when I look at how it's applied, most people rarely put it into application. He said, the best expression of it I have found in the Bible. This is the thing that guides my whole political philosophy. It is in substance, righteousness exalts a nation, sends a reproach to any people. He says, this constitutes my politics. The negative and the positive of everything I'm for, everything I'm against is based on that Bible verse. Everything I've done in 4 different presidential administrations, everything I've done in helping build the military, building the Mass 54th, Mass 55th. If you've seen the movie Glory, it was Frederick Douglass who put together those black regiments in the Civil War. He said, everything I've done has been on that. It's the positive and negative of my politics and the whole of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all I can to infuse this idea into the public mind. I want everybody to understand that what you do in politics should be based on Proverbs 14:34. That should be it. It has nothing to do with connections or demographics or parties or anything. It's got to do with righteousness. That's all God cares about. Now, having said that, Proverbs 14:34 is key. How do you measure the righteousness of a nation? I mean, how do we know whether God's going to bless or not bless it? And by the way, because Exodus 18:21 tells us that we're to elect our officials at the local, county, state, and federal level, how do you not only measure the righteousness of a city, of a nation, but how do you measure the righteousness of a state? How do you measure the righteousness of a county? How do you measure the righteousness of a city? Because there can be a time when a city's got it right and the state's got it wrong, or there can be a time when the nation's got it right and the county's got it wrong. I mean, you've got levels of righteousness at all of these political levels. So how does God measure that? How is it that he might be blessing a city when the nation's in trouble, or he might be blessing a state when the county's doing it wrong? How do you measure that? And the answer is very simply by public policies and how well they conform to God's standards. It's not by the individuals, it's not by the leaders, it's by the things they do. Righteousness in a nation is measured by the public policies in that nation. Now, there's ways of pointing to that. If you recall the confrontation that Ahab had with that Elijah had with Ahab and Jezebel, he says, this nation has been in trouble because of your public policies. He specifically called out 3. He said, religious persecution. You've been after the Lord's prophets. You're persecuting the Lord's people, which, we're kind of doing now with religious conscience and telling bakers what marriages they have to be involved with, and florists and photographers and everything else. So we're not letting people live according to their dictates of conscience the way God told them to. So we had religious persecution. He said also eminent domain. You wanted Naboth's vineyard. And so government went in and took property that didn't belong to it. It took Naboth's vineyard away from him, and God's not going to bless that. Again, that's that limited government. You're supposed to protect private property. You're not supposed to take it. And so Ahab and Jezebel taking private property, which again is a common policy in government today, and also suborning perjury. You perverted the course of justice. You determine the end you want to get, and then you bring false witnesses in if that's what it takes for you to get the object. You have a ruling you want from the judges, and you stack it up to get that ruling. You're not after righteousness. So he called them out for those three. Now, it's significant that in doing that, a public policy can affect every single person in that entity, even those who disagree with that policy. In other words, what Ahab and Jezebel did affected everybody in the nation, even those who disagreed with it. And I'll give you an example. You remember that after Elijah had that confrontation with the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel, and God shows up, and God sends fire from heaven, and you got the 400 false prophets and 450 prophets of Baal. After that, Elijah goes off in that cave, and he's by himself, and he's there with the Lord, and he says, "Get me out of here, God. I'm the only one left." And God essentially says, "Shut up." He said, "I got 7,000 people who have never bowed their knee to Baal. You're not the only one left." But what's interesting is all 7,000, including Elijah, went through 3.5 years of famine. They all went without water and food for 3.5 years because the wicked policies of the nation brought God's judgment on the nation. You remember, it took God sending ravens, literally, to Elijah to keep him alive. So there's a famine. The good guys weren't exempted from the famine that came on the nation because of the bad policies of the nation. So it is true that a public policy affects every single person. Even if you disagree with abortion, there's effects that are going on in the nation because we allow bad things to occur. And every one of us comes under those negative effects. Now, why would that be the case? I have to tell you, I had a real spiritual epiphany in reading the records of the Constitutional Convention. And in reading those records, they got into a discussion over why this is true. And I'd never realized this before. And George Mason, who's called the father of the Bill of Rights, he's the guy who really got the 10 Amendments added to the Constitution. At the Constitutional Convention, when they're framing the Constitution, this is what he reminded the other delegates. He says, "As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, so they must be in this." He said, by an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Now, I knew that I would stand before God one day, as all of us will, and be judged for everything we thought, 1 Corinthians 4, everything we've done, Hebrews 4, everything we've said. Jesus said in Matthew 12, every idle word you've spoken, you'll give account thereof in the day of judgment. We know that we'll stand before God and answer. But I'd never thought about the fact that nations don't ever stand before God in the future. They exist only in the present. Therefore, God has to judge nations right now based on what they do. God's not going to resurrect the Soviet Union 2,000 years from now and say, "Why did you kill 60 million people in that purge that you did?" They have to answer for it right now. And so because nations don't have a future existence, they have to. And by the way, we used to also teach this theologically. This is one of the famous preachers out of the American founding, Chandler Robbins. This is what he said in his sermons. He says, "The supreme governor of the world rewards or punishes nations and communities in this life, only in this life. Political bodies are but the creatures of time." In other words, they're here only for the present. He said they have no existence as such, but in the present state, consequently, they're incapable of future rewards, future punishments or rewards in the future. He says the divine being therefore manifests the purity of his nature towards such societies by rewarding or punishing them here according to their public conduct. In other words, cities, counties, states, nations get it right now, not in the future. They're not going to be resurrected. God's not going to resurrect the United States 2,000 years from now and say, "Why did you guys allow abortion at Roe v. Wade? What were you thinking?" I mean, there's consequences right now. Now, we may not always recognize those consequences. Historians in the future will. They'll look back and say, so that's why it affects every single policy, because nations get their judgments right now. Now, having said that, righteousness exalts a nation. So if righteousness is the key to God blessing a nation, any nation, not just America, but any other nation, how do you get righteous policies in a nation? I mean, how do you get? And the answer is Proverbs 29:2. Proverbs 29:2 tell us that when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. So if you want good policies, you got to get the right kind of people leading the country or leading the state or leading the county or leading the city. You want the right kind of leaders that will do righteous things. Now, I'll show you how this worked out in the founding era, because in the founding era, when we did the Declaration of Independence, what we did was we wiped out 13 state governments. They were all colonial governments. They were all put there. So the American Revolution, what we did was we wiped out all British government, but we needed government. We knew from Romans 13 that you're not supposed to be without government. The Declaration of Independence wiped out 13 colonial governments. So the Founding Fathers knew that they needed government. That's really clear in the Bible. You're not supposed to be without government. God is the one who ordained civil government. He ordained it before he ordained the church. It's the second of the three institutions God ordained. So needing government, these guys who wrote the Declaration, who wiped out the British governments, went back to create new governments in their states. And that's why if you look, for example, at a state like New Jersey, John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration, goes back and writes the original Constitution of New Jersey, 1776. And you'll find out that after we wiped out state government, or wiped out colonial governments, we started state governments largely in 1776. That's when you had the first Constitution of South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and all these states. And in the same way, Maryland, out of Maryland, you have people like Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration. He goes back home and writes the 1776 Constitution of Maryland because we don't want to be without government. But these guys understood the Bible well enough that I want you to see what they put in their governments. For example, if I take you to the government of, let's just take Delaware, the state of Delaware. 1776 is the Constitution of Delaware. And the guys who wrote that Constitution of Delaware are signers of the Declaration. You got folks over here like Thomas McKean. You got folks like George Reed, and you have Dickinson. We talked about him earlier with inalienable rights. These guys go back and write the original Constitution for Delaware of 1776. And understanding that righteousness exalts a nation, look what they put in the Delaware Constitution. Delaware Constitution 1776 says this: every person who shall be chosen a member of either house must say, I do profess faith in God the Father and in the Lord Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures, the Old and New Testament, to be given by divine inspiration. Now, that would be a pretty cool requirement to go to seminary today, but seminaries don't even require that. That's what the Founding Fathers put out, said, you want to hold political office in this state? Why would they do that? Because if you get people who understand this, you're more likely to get policies that God will bless, which is more likely for everybody in the state to be blessed because they get the right kind of policies from the right kind of leaders. You have the same thing that happens when you go to the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts Constitution, guys who signed the Declaration went back and created the original Massachusetts Constitution. Robert Treat Paine, you got Samuel Adams, you got John Adams, you got John Hancock. These guys all went back and did the original Constitution of Massachusetts, which says this. It says, any person chosen governor or lieutenant governor, counselor, senator, or representative must say, I do declare that I believe the Christian religion, have a firm persuasion of its truth. Again, that's the requirement the Founding Fathers put in Massachusetts. If you want to hold office in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is nowhere close to that now. Do you know that that requirement is still in the Massachusetts Constitution to this day? But see, the people in Massachusetts aren't concerned about electing God-fearing people, and they don't elect God-fearing people, and they sure don't read their Constitution. I mean, that's an old document. It's 200 years old. Who cares about that? But see, this is the provision that we understood biblically to try to preserve good government. If I take you to another state, take you to Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 was actually written by Ben Franklin. And we call Franklin one of our least religious founding fathers. Look what the requirement is that he put in the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. It says, and each member of the legislature shall say, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, and I acknowledge the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, to be given by divine inspiration. That's the requirement put in by your least religious founding father. So when you get told Franklin's an atheist, agnostic, deist, no. He's less religious than those guys were. He's more religious than nearly 99% of Christians I know today. I mean, this is the requirement. He says, these are the guys, we don't want anybody in public office that doesn't have this understanding right there. Then you also have the state of North Carolina. You look at the North Carolina Constitution, 1776. It says, no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Christian religion or the divine authority, either the Old or New Testaments, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department of this state. We're not even letting you close to government if you don't understand that righteousness exalts a nation, sends reproach to any people. So this is what we did throughout. Now, with all of that behind us, This is all designed to say, get the right kind of people in office. You want people in office who will give you righteous policies. That brings us to where we are right now. We are looking at an election at this point in time. We've got one coming up in about 3 weeks. And in looking at that election, there's two questions. I speak all over the nation. I speak to about 600 groups a year. So every day I'm in 1 or 2 or 3 locations. And the question I'm hearing two questions from Christians is, should I vote in this election? I don't like anybody who's running. Should I vote? And number 2 is, if I do decide to vote, who should I vote for? So let me answer those 2 questions in the remaining time we have left. And I want to answer those questions. The first one is, should I vote? I want to answer that by going to a good friend of mine, Rabbi Daniel Lapin. I'm Christian. I'm called an evangelical conservative Christian, all the adjectives, the Bible thumping, whatever. Media calls me all sorts of things, but I'm considered a very conservative evangelical Christian. And I have a personal rabbi, and I think every single Christian needs a rabbi. He is my personal rabbi. I call him very frequently. I cannot tell you how much he's increased the depth of my Christian faith. I was called to testify at the U.S. Senate on global warming, so global warming expert. And so I had my testimony all lined out to give the U.S. Senate. And I called Rabbi and I said, Rabbi, here's what I plan to do at the Senate. Here's what I'm going to talk about. And he listened very patiently. And he said, well, that's good, but may I remind you of something? And so in about 5 to 7 minutes, he took me through Genesis 1, 2, and 3. He says, now, I want you to see the order that things happen there. And based on what you see the order here, and based on what your testimony is going to be, you might think about, and I rewrote my testimony. It was such a good biblical revelation that he showed in the order of the sequence of creation, that God created things in a certain sequence that led to what the issues we were dealing with global warming. And so I rewrote my testimony because it was such a good spiritual revelation. And so in talking to Rabbi Lapin, he's taught me a lot of things. One of the things he told me, he says, the first time that anybody ever heard from God, the first time God spoke to man, God spoke to Adam. And when God spoke to Adam, Adam heard him, and God spoke in Hebrew. That was the language that God chose. God could have chosen French, Italian, Russian, Latin, Greek, Spanish, English, whatever. God himself chose to speak in Hebrew. He says that means that every word in Hebrew came out of the mouth of God, which means that every word in Hebrew means something significant. And give me an example. Remember the little contest that was going between Leah and Rachel? They wanted kids for Jacob, and so they got all those contests going. And so Leah finally has a son. And that son, when she has that son, she says, "Behold, a son." You know what she named her son? She named him, "Behold, a son." It's the word we call Reuben. But Reuben means, behold, a son. And then when Rachel had her child, and she says, "Son of my right hand." You know what she named him? She named him son of my right hand, which we call Benjamin. That's what Benjamin means. So you find that in Hebrew, you don't have words like Fred and Bob and George, and every name means something. And you'll find that in Hebrew, when something happened, they said, joy, and that's what they named the child, or sorrow, and that's what they named it. Whatever it was, every word in Hebrew means something significant. And so as he was pointing that out to me, he says, therefore, because every word means something, he continued and he said, what you can't say in Hebrew also means a whole lot. I said, what do you mean? He said, for example, he said, did you know that in Hebrew, you cannot say the word coincidence? It doesn't exist. Really? He said, it never came out of God's mouth. It never occurred to God that something was a coincidence. What do we think? God sat up there and said, oh, I didn't see that coming. Man, that was a big surprise. There's no coincidence. It never crossed God's mind that something might be a coincidence because he ordains and he plants and he directs and he guides. So in Hebrew, you cannot say the word coincidence, which means in English, we shouldn't say coincidence. We shouldn't say lucky. We shouldn't say fortunate because it never crossed God's mind that we were lucky or that was accidental or, I thought that is deep theology. I can study that for a long time, that nothing is coincidence, because we talk about, oh, you were really fortunate you didn't get whacked in that car wreck. No, it wasn't fortunate. It had nothing to do with it. God had everything to do with it. So it's a different way of thinking. I said, what else can't you say in Hebrew? He said, well, You can't say the word retirement in Hebrew. It doesn't exist. Well, that actually makes sense because there was never a point in time when God did not want us to be productive. He put us here to be productive. There's never a point in time that he doesn't want us to be productive. We have one example in the New Testament of a guy who retired. He laid up, had a great retirement, and he laid up and said, oh, now I've laid all this stuff up for myself, now I can retire. And the Bible says, they appeared and said, this, you fool. This night your soul is required of you. The guy who said, I'm going to retire and do nothing for a while, God says, if you're not going to do anything, let's get you out of there. And so it's like retirement is not an option. Now, you may change job descriptions, but you're always supposed to be productive for God. He didn't put you here to not be productive. He put you here for a reason, and you've got that reason until the time he takes you on. Hebrews 9:27 is appointed a man who wants to die, and after that, the judgment. You're going to be here for the time of his appointment because he's got you here for a specific reason. There's no retirement. I said, what else can't you say? He said, well, you can't say the word fair. The word fair doesn't exist in Hebrew. And, you know, it's significant. I've always been opposed to the word fair because fair is a subjective term. What's fair for somebody else is not fair for the, you know, it's just, it's opinion. But think about what happened to Jesus. Was that fair? No, but aren't we glad it happened to Jesus? You know, because it wasn't fair, but it's how we get our salvation. Jesus didn't do anything to be killed for. That wasn't fair that they killed him. He's the only sinless life that ever lived. But because of what happened, what happened to Joseph wasn't fair. How does this guy get thrown in prison because his brothers are ticked off at him? Yeah, but it wasn't fair, but that's what ended up saving the whole family and birthing the nation of Israel was the fact that he got thrown in prison and was in Egypt and happened to be in prison in Egypt where he rose. See, it had nothing to do with what's fair. And think about Job. You know, what happened to Job wasn't fair. And this is something you need to know. God is not nearly so concerned with what happens to you as with how you respond to what happens to you. Think about Job. What happened to Job was not fair. He lost everything he owned, but that wasn't the deal. God stood up here with Satan and said, Satan, you can hit him, but I guarantee you he's going to respond right. You watch. He'll do the right thing. See, it was all about how Job responded to what happened to him. It wasn't fair what happened. But at the end, because he responded right, God gave him twice as much as what he started with because the response was right. It has nothing to do. The Bible is filled with stories that aren't fair. Another word, I said, what else can't you say in Hebrew? He said, well, you can't say the word rights. The word rights, you don't have rights in Hebrew. All you have are responsibilities. You can say responsibilities, you can't say rights. And see, this is one of the things we get into today. We talk about our rights. No. We don't have rights, we have responsibilities. See, rights makes it that becomes an entitlement mentality that certain things are due us. Nothing's due you. What's due you is you're to have a responsibility to do things for others. It's not about you, it's about others. And so that's what happens with voting. And I have a right to vote, and I don't like anybody running, so I'm not going to vote this election. No, you don't have that choice. You have a responsibility to vote. It's not your choice whether you will or won't vote. This goes back to Matthew 25, Luke 19, where the master called all the servants together. Jesus called them together and said, I'm giving each one of you a little trust here, and you take care of it until I get back. He comes back and says, what'd you do with that trust I gave you? That guy said, I didn't do anything with it. Nothing. And he's the guy who got in trouble. Same way, God says, hey, I've created a nation here. I'm putting it in your hands. You guys be stewards of it till I get back. Luke 19:13, you occupy until I come. He gets back and says, what'd you do with that vote I gave you? I didn't do anything with it. Sorry, he's the guy that got in trouble. You've been given a trust. It's not your option whether you got to do something with it or not. If you don't do something with it, you're going to be in trouble. You have a responsibility to do something. So the question of whether or not I'm going to vote is not an option for Christians. You know, we used to teach this so thoroughly out of the pulpit that as you get 200 years after the American founding, we had the first elections in America in 1619. 200 years later, we're still having 100% voter turnout in America because it was our duty to vote. It wasn't our right to vote. It was our duty to vote. Now, let me kind of show you how this works today. Voting today, if you want to vote, according to the Constitution, you just got to be a citizen and 18 years older. That's it. That's all it takes to vote. Now, what we ask is one piece of paperwork. Register to vote so that we can make sure that you're actually the one voting, that you didn't vote 23 times and nobody else is voting for. This is your responsibility to vote, and because we want to know it's you that does it. And so you register to vote. In America today, only 67.1% of Americans are registered to vote. So right off the bat, we have 1/3 of Americans who say, I don't care what happens to this country. Anything can happen to it, and I don't care which way it goes. I'm going to have nothing to do. Really? That's 1/3 who have said, I'm not going to be a steward. I'm not going to account to God. Or you will account to God, whether you think you will or not. You will account. But 1/3 has said, I'm going to do nothing. Now, it's interesting that when you come to a presidential election like we have right now, that's when you get the highest voter turnout of registered voters. And so since 1980, over about the last 36 years, in a presidential election, what we get is we get an average of 54% voter turnout. But that's 54% of registered voters. That's 54% of 67.1%, which means only 36% of Americans vote in presidential elections. And it only takes half of that to win, which is 18%, which since 1980, only 1 out of 5 Americans has chosen the President of the United States. Are you kidding me? 4 out of 5 Americans didn't choose the President? Yeah. See, we think it's a big popular... It's not, but back when we had 100% voter turnout, you got real different outcomes from what we do now. And you have primary votes, and few Christians vote in primaries. I mean, we don't have that many Christians who vote in general elections, but when you get to primaries where you're choosing your candidate, Christians definitely don't show up there. And so we get to November and we don't like the candidates we got. Well, Christians had all sorts of choices back at the beginning, but they didn't do anything with it. So we get to this point. So you don't like where we are now? Blame it on Christians. Don't blame it on any candidates. Don't blame it on political parties. Don't blame it on the nation. Don't blame it on the media. Don't blame it on how much it costs to be in politics. Blame it on the fact that only 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States since 1980. Now, that's presidential elections. When you get to 2 years ago when we chose governors and we chose senators and reps, and 2 years from now when we'll do it again, you look in, that's called off-year elections. And in off-year elections, only 39% of registered voters, that's 39% of 67.1%, which is only 26% of adults voting. It takes half of that to win, 13%. What you're looking at is only 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our U.S. senators and our congressional. 1 out of 8. So where America is right now is really a choice of our bad stewardship. If we understood that we don't have rights, we have duties, we would have a whole different nation. And that goes right. 72 to 78% of the nation says they're Christian. We're not acting like it, but we have opportunities to change it. So now that's presidential and that's off year. When you get into something beyond that, like when you get into local elections, like where we had the election in Houston, Texas, where we chose folks that said, hey, you cannot take a stand for traditional marriage, and if you do, you're in trouble. And that's why, if you remember the 5 pastors in Houston, the government subpoenaed all their sermons, said, we want to see all 17 forms of correspondence. We want everything you do on social media, everything you do on Facebook or Twitter, anything you do on Periscope. We want all your emails. We want all your texts. We want to see what you've said about marriage, because if you've criticized homosexual marriage, you're in trouble in Houston. Really? And then San Antonio was even worse. San Antonio passed what's called a non-discrimination ordinance. And in San Antonio, the ordinance says if you criticize, no, it doesn't even say that. It says if you stand for traditional marriage, if you say that marriage between a man and a woman, it's a Class C misdemeanor. It's a $500 a day fine. If you're in office, they dismiss you from office as malfeasance. If you just come out and say, I believe marriage between a man and a woman, that's what God said, you're gone. Really? How did that happen? Well, what happens in local elections is when you have a city election like Houston or San Antonio or Dallas or Fort Worth or Waxahachie or anything else, you usually average only a 6% voter turnout in the elections. Now, that's 6% of 67.1%, which means only 4% of the adults vote in those elections. And since it only takes half of that to win, you're choosing mayors and school board members and everything with 2% of the vote. 2%. That's really low. Let me show you how easy it is to turn this around. We work with about 70,000 pastors across the nation right now, a group called Black Robe Regiment. And we're showing pastors how that, you can take your city in a heartbeat. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to take you to Arkansas for a minute, and there's that 2%. I'm going to take you to Arkansas for a minute, to the town of Bentonville, Arkansas. Bentonville, Arkansas, northwest Arkansas, a very conservative part of the state politically. And Bentonville, and that's the hometown of Walmart, 40,000 people in the town. the school board said, hey, we're going to do one locker room and one bathroom. Genders, that's a matter of whatever you think. So we're going to have one bathroom for all boys and girls and one locker room for... And a Christian lady in that town said, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, where are you on the issue of abortion? Because remember, if they get that right, they'll be 90% right on the other issues. Where are you on the issue of marriage protection, sexuality, on religious acknowledgments and conscience? Where are you on judges? Where are you on Israel? Yeah, but my issue is debt. We got to stop. Your issue can be debt, but it's got to be number 6 on the list. After you deal with those 5, then you can look at where they are on debt. Yeah, but my issue is immigration. Great. After you look at those 5, now you can look at immigration. See, these are the 5 that God puts up there. So it's not who you vote for, it's what you vote for. You go through, if you need help, we've got a voter's guide called ChristianVoterGuide.com. We have voter guides up there for every state. We have voter's guides up there for presidential candidates. Go through and look, because what you're voting for is righteousness that exalts a nation. So finishing up today, you've seen the background, you see how important it is, but it's not whether you'll vote or not, you will. And it's not who you vote for, it's what you vote for, the policies you're going to get, because you can have good leaders who did bad things and bad leaders who do good things. It's what? And so that's the things you guys need to remember. Dr. Bridges, thanks for letting me share. God bless.
Gel bir ardına.